Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens. We are here today with Demarquin Johnson, who is a legislative assistant to Congresswoman Pressley. Demarquin, you recently graduated from Harvard Law School and were awarded the 2020 Martha H. Mauzy Award for the Advancement of Democratic Governance. Congratulations, and thank you so much for your service to our country.
Thank you, Sri, for having me. I'm really glad to be in dialogue and virtual conversation with you right now.
Demarquin, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what inspired you to go into law, public service, and policy?
Yeah, I'll say that I'm originally from Houston, Texas, actually right outside of Houston, Missouri City, Texas. And my upbringing with, you know, the issues that I saw, the folks that I were exposed to really encouraged me. And I'll say it was a community effort that was pushing me to not only take roles in leadership, but to see myself as a contributor to society, as a problem solver. And I think back to my days in school where math was my favorite subject. You had a problem and you had to solve it. And that's what I try to think about now, even in the work that I do in public service. There are so many problems that have been longstanding in our local communities, in our states, and across our nation and across the globe. So being able to see those problems, confront them head on and work them through so you can solve them is what I really enjoy. So since going to Howard University, a historically Black college and university in Washington, D.C., to attending Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, I've always just taken that approach of these are problems that can be solved. And I'm really encouraged by the work that I'm doing now and the progress we're making in Congress and the progress we're making just in our communities.
And Demarquin, you talk about how people create policy and not just people elected to Congress, but people in communities across the country. Can you elaborate on this and how youth can potentially get involved as well?
Yeah, I firmly believe that the only way that we are able to be a democracy is if we're listening to the people, if we're responsive to people. And it is my view that democracy works best when there is greatest participation. So the fact that youth are already involved, I want to be very clear about that. Youth are already involved. You obviously are an example of that. But when we look globally, but specifically across the nation, when we think about social movements, youth have always been involved. One of the examples I think about is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, during the Civil Rights era. Civil rights movement was one that had a lot of older folks. We think about Martin Luther King Jr. We think about Rosa Parks, but it also had a lot of young folks. At the time, Congressman John Lewis was in his late teens, early 20s, and leading the fight, leading the charge. But they also learn from older folks. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is also learn from those that have been in this struggle, that have had experiences and have lessons that they can share. So one of the most important things that I think youth can do is learn, but also continue to be forceful, to be aggressive, to question folks, to make sure that no matter what happens, you don't take no for an answer. I think that that's something that precedent and history has shown us often works well when we're moving towards progress.
And Demarquin, COVID-19 has not only caused several disruptions, but has also heightened disparities that already exist in our society, particularly in healthcare. In your opinion, what are some of the possible solutions to achieve greater healthcare equity?
Yeah, I think that when we think about healthcare equity, it is absolutely vital that we are able to understand that these inequities exist. When we talk about racial inequities, it exists because racism exists. When we think about homophobia and transphobia, when we think about sexism, those things have impacts on our healthcare system. Those things have impacts on our individual health and our societal health. So we have to really confront those issues, those forms of oppression head on. I'll share that I am a supporter of Medicare for all. I think that we need to do some necessary and critical changes to our healthcare infrastructure, and that means the way that we pay, the way that doctors are able to offer services. And I think the pandemic, as you mentioned, has shown a light on the different ways in which we can reimagine what this looks like. But more importantly, I want to make sure that we broaden our conversation around healthcare, not just to the way the system operates and the insurance system or the different corporations. I want to make sure we think about the social determinants of health that are outside of the healthcare space, usually in conversation, but are so important to what our health actually looks like. Social determinants of health, such as food insecurity and housing insecurity, they play a big role in what I am able to do health wise and what my community is able to do health wise. I'd also share that when it comes to economic prosperity, we need to make sure that we make those changes there. So, confronting these issues are not going to be easy. These are problems that have been around for years, they'll be around much longer, but they are so vital to actually achieving healthcare equity.
And Demarquin, as the editor in chief of the Harvard Journal of African American Policy, you wrote about and published the journal's issue on life after incarceration, centering on the voices of people who were currently and formerly incarcerated. What has been your experience been fighting for those who are incarcerated, and what are your keys to success in finding solutions to some of the challenging problems that our country faces?
Yeah, I don't think I'm the first person to say this, but I will say it now that mass incarceration is the civil rights issue of our time. You know, it's an offshoot, it's a descendant, it is directly derived from our slavery system in the United States. It is expensive, over $1 trillion goes into our criminal legal system. And we know that over 2 million people are incarcerated. And it's not including the folks that are going through, the day-to-day jailing, arrest, and exposure to the criminal legal system. So in recognition of all of those issues, I think it's so important. And I want to be honest that like my family, we're directly impacted. Most people's families are directly impacted by mass incarceration. And it is the case that we have to reimagine what it looks like to have safety, to have public safety. Too often we've been thinking that imprisonment is the only solution, is the only option. And we have some cities, some states, and even initiatives through the federal government that are challenging that notion. But we're not doing enough and we're not moving quick enough. We need to be quicker. We need to do more. It is important to me uh, with the lessons that I learned. I think you know this because you mentioned the Harvard Journal of African American Policy. And with that issue on life after incarceration, we were able to get letters and research, poetry directly from people who are currently and formerly incarcerated. It wasn't like, the typical journal would have academics, it'll have lawyers, it'll have people who are professionals and have studied this issue. We got the people that are directly impacted speaking on it, talking to us about what the policy implications is. And we need to be doing that regularly. We need to make sure that those who are most impacted, those who are, closest to the actual pain, make sure that they are the ones that have their voice heard at the policymaking table. We need to empower them. We need to make sure that people who are incarcerated have the programs that they need to not only be to go through rehabilitation and have their basic needs met, but also programs that'll set them up for a future during reentry. We need to also make sure, and this is coming from, I strongly believe in democracy, and I think that the article you mentioned talks about this, is that we need to make sure that folks have the right to vote. We need to make sure that they're citizens, because they are citizens. And in a democracy, citizens vote. So we need to make sure that they have that access to participate and to contribute to society in that way. So there are a lot of problems, and you mentioned this, there are a lot of challenging problems. And I think that some of the solutions, or I'll say the best solutions, come from those who are directly impacted, and we need to hear them.
And I think you bring up such a great point about really elaborating and heightening the voices of those who are truly experiencing this. And I think that it was so incredible what you wrote about because it did exactly that, taking those experiences from people who are directly impacted by this and really giving that the opportunity to be shown. And another topic you did talk about was voting, and you work with Fair Vote and electoral reforms. And I wanted to know, what are some of the ways to get every single young voter to vote?
Yeah, you know, I love the fact that like people have the ability to have their voice heard directly through the ballot box. I want to be honest though, that's not the only way you can have your voice heard.
Right.
We've seen that over the past year when it comes to protests. We've seen it with calling your members of Congress about legislation. And I want to be clear that young folks can do that now. Young folks don't have to wait to have, you know, the once every 4 years presidential election, once every 2 years federal elections, or whenever their state or local elections are, once they turn 18 or whatever age it is in their jurisdiction. What can happen now is being engaged in the community, being in dialogue with elected leaders, and holding them accountable. I also think that it's, very important that our education system highlights the importance of civics. I'll tell you, in high school, I did not learn how to register to vote. I did not learn what a voter registration form even looked like, where to get one from. Those are things that I learned, and it's something that's critical to our lives. So the inability to learn that through one of our longstanding institutions, which is our schools, I think we're missing out on a really clear opportunity to engage folks. The only other thing that I'll say that I know was a really big push this past 2020 election was getting young folks, even if they're not old enough to vote, to serve as poll workers. I have served as a poll worker and I loved it. You can also get paid for it in some jurisdictions, so it's also a way to make money. But I very much enjoyed the opportunity just because you get to see the voting process upfront and personal. You're also talking to other folks in your community who are also volunteering or being paid to serve as poll workers. So I'm always a advocate for folks that if they have the time and they have the ability to do so, to serve as a poll worker, even if it's just maybe 2 days during early voting time period, or if it's for maybe 2 hours on election day. That can really do amazing work, not only personally, but also for the entire community.
And talking about, being able to work in the polls even, at a young age, and you talked about protests and people already sort of getting involved in government even before they're able to vote. And I was hoping you could, elaborate on this and, kind of describe some of the strengths of today's youth and how we can better leverage those strengths.
Yeah. I mean, what this is an example of is like tech savviness. When I was younger, and I grew up with a computer most of my life, and I still would not be able to put this together. So I think that like young folks are a lot more tech savvy than previous generations, and being able to harness that energy and motivate and encourage others while connecting with and educating others is something that is unique to the youth of today. And I would wholly support happening more and more. Additionally, I'd say that with greater technology access, there's greater exposure. There's greater exposure to learn. Uh, Not only the internet has so much, and we know news and television, but learning from each other. The opportunity to hear what youth are doing in somewhere like Tacoma Park, Maryland. Tacoma Park, Maryland has lowered their voting age for their local elections. So people who are 17, for example, can vote for the mayor. So being able to learn how they did that, connecting with those folks, maybe you can bring it to your community in St. Louis, for example. It's things like that that it connects folks and allows for younger people to take advantage of things that people who are older didn't have the opportunity to do. And then one of the other things I do want to mention is just like I said this, I used the word fearless before, and I want to reiterate that young people have been leading movements and social progress throughout time. Uh, there is a there is a common notion that young people are more fed up with the system, even though they haven't been living through it as long as older folks. And therefore, they're fearless in their advocacy to change it. We have some very long-standing traditions and institutions that don't want to see change, but young folks are presenting new ideas and they're letting people hear their ideas. They're making people hear their ideas, and encouraging that is something that I want to do and something that I think is necessary for our country.
And Demarquin, what is your message for teens and youth aspiring to pursue social justice, be innovators, and be leaders like yourself, and be a part of the solution?
Start now. I say start now. You don't have to wait until you have a degree. You don't have to wait until you go to graduate school. You don't have to wait until you have a job or you're financially well off. You can start now. I want to just really reiterate that it is important to have youth voices. And without folks speaking up, we're missing out. This is a lifetime endeavor to pursue social justice. It is not something that's just a hobby, something that you can do on Twitter every once in a while. It is truly a lifetime commitment. And it requires you to take chances. It requires folks to make decisions that are tough and will have long-standing implications. And to be honest, you won't always be successful. There are going to be times in which we have L's. You know, they say your losses, but I also know you can call them your lessons. You're going to learn a lot of hard lessons, and those L's can be things that set you up for a better future. So I really want to just encourage folks to take action. Don't necessarily have to wait. You can do this and stay committed to it. But I also want to say something that wasn't necessarily publicly shared in the past, but is more so getting attention, is to just also take care of yourself. Your mental health is important. What we're being exposed to is not normal. We're seeing, especially during a pandemic, we're seeing people die. We're seeing people sick. We're seeing trauma regularly, and that's not normal. We're not made to experience that, and we shouldn't have to. So I want to make sure that people know to take care of themselves, take care of their mental health, and they surround themselves with folks who are going to encourage them and uplift them. It is so important to be in community and to be able to have a community like the one that you're creating with this production. And I think that the youth are going to be all right. They're going to be pushing us forward. They're going to be encouraging me. They're going to be encouraging members of Congress. They're going to be encouraging the mayors. They're going to be encouraging business leaders to do the right thing, to do things better. So I'm really, really looking forward to that.
Demarquin, thank you so much for your service to our youth and to our country. And thank you so much for your time today and answering all of our questions.
No problem. Thank you for having me.